We're with David Kiehn in Niles, California, at the Niles S&A Silent Film Museum. He'd like to share his historical research on Bronco Billy and early Westerns.
Gilbert M. Anderson was the founding member with George Spohr of the S&A Film Company based in Chicago in 1907. And S&A was the name for their company based on the initials of their last names, S for Spohr and A for Anderson, and they spelled it phonetically to give it, I guess, a little bit of class. Spohr was the money man who financed the beginning of the operations, and Anderson was the creative force behind the company. He's already been directing and writing and acting in films and wanted to start his own film company, and George Spohr gave him the opportunity to do that. Like I said, they started in Chicago in 1907, and after a certain amount of time, mostly shooting on the streets of Chicago, Anderson decided he wanted to go west during the winter of 1908, when filming was pretty difficult in Chicago, outdoors. As you can imagine, they needed a lot of sunlight to film outdoors, so sunny California was supposed to be the place to be, and Anderson had never been to California before, and came to San Francisco and was promptly rained out. But he was told about Southern California and went down there to shoot some films, but he really didn't like Southern California. There was something about San Francisco and the Bay Area that appealed to him, and he kept coming back. He was in Los Gatos in 1910, in San Rafael in 1911, where he made 42 films. And then finally, he discovered Niles in 1912 and came here with 52 people from his company in April of 1912. And within a week, he realized that Niles was the place he wanted to settle down after traveling all over the West for 3 years. And one of the major reasons was Niles Canyon, where the scenery was perfect for Westerns, which is what he'd started shooting in 1909. So he started buying up land in Niles and built houses for cast and crew people. And in 1913, they built a movie studio on what's now Niles Boulevard. And for the next 4 years, they made over 350 films in Niles. Every week they would produce a Bronco Billy Western, which is what Anderson was famous for as a character named Bronco Billy, and Snakeville Comedy, a comedy series that had a Western theme to it as well. And occasionally they would branch out with other kinds of contemporary films or various dramatic films with a Western theme. Anderson was the first Western movie star cowboy with his character named Bronco Billy. It was a series that he made 140 of these Bronco Billy Westerns over starting in 1910 when they were in El Paso, Texas. And the series really took off in 1911 when they were in San Rafael, but the bulk of the Bronco Billy films were made here in Niles. Here he is in his character Bronco Billy. This photograph was taken in 1913. at a George Fraser studio in San Francisco, where he posed for several different photographs to promote his character. The films were shot and developed and edited here in Niles, and then they were sent to the Chicago studio for printing and distribution, and all of the publicity materials were made up in Chicago. But they did the bulk of the work here, preparing, like filming, editing, and then shipping it off to Chicago. So they really didn't get a chance to see the finished product until it came to this theater here in Niles, the Edison Theatre, where all of the SNA people could come to watch themselves and their competition on the screen. So Bronco Billy and the other SNA company members, including Charlie Chaplin, watched movies in this very theater when it was in operation during the time that SNA was here. So why don't we take a look at the whole company when they were in Niles over here. So here is the SNA company while they were in Niles in 1913. Bronco Billy Anderson is there in the middle, and his head scenario writer, Josephine Rector, is right down here. Fred Church, who often played the villains or the juvenile lead in some of the westerns, is right here, and Brinsley Shaw, who is most often the villain in the films, is right here. There were members of the Snaeffield comedy troupe. Harry Todd, Victor Potel, and Margaret Jocelyn are right here. And this little character here, Augustus Carney, was known as Alkali Ike in the Snaeffield comedy series. Over here is Tom Kreiser, who was one of the cowboys for the company. And he was taught by Anderson how to edit film. And after the studio closed in 1916, he worked for Harold Lloyd as the film editor for his comedies in Hollywood. Over here is Raleigh Tothero, who became a cameraman for the company. And after the studio closed, he went to work for Charlie Chaplin in Los Angeles and was his cameraman for the next 38 years. The rest of the people are various cast and crew people who, some of them were Niles residents, others had been traveling with Anderson all over the West, and others were stage actors who came to the studio after they settled here in Niles. When they first arrived in 1912, their first studio was this barn on 2nd Street. They had a tent as their office, and they stored the props on the main floor, and up in the loft was a dressing room where they would change into their costumes. Behind the building was an open-air stage that they set up to shoot the interior scenes of their films. Because they needed a lot of light, you couldn't actually go into a house or a business and shoot the interior unless you had a lot of expensive lights. And so they just did it outside with a cloth covering over the top to soften the light. And it worked very well. So here is the set for a Western sheriff's office set up with Anderson in the middle directing the scene, Harry Todd and True Boardman, the actors in the scene, Jess Robbins, the cameraman for this particular film. And here is the camera that they were using, which was built by Bell and Howell Company in Chicago. They were very closely associated with SNA. Donald Bell had actually been a projectionist for George Spohr in the 1890s. And when Bell and Howell was formed in 1907, the same year that SNA was formed, all of the equipment that SNA was using for their laboratory and their filming was made by Bell and Howell. So SNA bought the first cameras that Bell and Howell ever built, and they had a long association. As new equipment was produced by Bell and Howell, SNA was invariably the first company that bought the equipment. And so SNA gave a big boost to that company. So let's go to another. So this is a typical setup a little later when they were in the process of building their new studio on what's now Niles Boulevard. The stage floor that they'd already put up was able to accommodate several camera setups at the same time. So for instance, over here, they're shooting a general store scene, and over here, they're shooting a Bronco Billy film that's set up in what looks like a barn. And so they've got two different cameras, two different crews, making two different films at the same time. That was one of the advantages of making silent films. You didn't have to record sound or worry about recording sound. So you could have as many crews as you could get in a proximity, and it really wouldn't matter. Nobody would know the difference on the screen. So you can see the general store looks pretty elaborate, and on the screen, it would literally look like a general store. But the prop department would have these individual cans and things all set up in a group so that if you just pulled out all these bottles, they would all be fashioned together and you just put them into the shelves. They would have this all set up so they could make films very quickly. And in fact, Bronco Billy prided himself in making films in a very quick manner. Sometimes he would produce a whole 15-minute film in one day. Often he would shoot 5 films in a week and then spend the rest of the month in San Francisco having a good time. The Snavely Comedy would continue to produce films throughout the month, and so they were busy all the time. But Anderson, because he was ahead of the studio here, could essentially do whatever he wanted, and this is the thing that he preferred to do, shoot very quickly. Another aspect of shooting these silent films is that Anderson prided himself in using as few title cards to describe the situations as possible. Sometimes these films would have no title cards in the middle at all. They would just be telling the story through the actions seen on the screen. So that could create a problem in later years when these films were being preserved, and if the missing main title was gone, some people would not know when they discovered a film what film it was unless you knew exactly what the story was and be able to figure it out. There's some films that are in archives today that have the wrong title on them because Anderson also remade the film several times over the years. So if he liked a story that he'd done in 1910, it might show up in Niles in 1913 again with the same exact storyline, just different actors with them. So unless you knew who the actors were that were playing with them, you might not know which film it really was when you're trying to preserve the film. And that's one of the things that I've done in looking at all of the SNA films that have survived, figuring out where they are in the various archives and what films actually survive. Of the 350 films that SNA made here in Niles, only about 60 or 65 films survive. From the SNA company as a whole, from 1907 to 1918, they made just over 2,000 films, and only about 250 of those survive. So there's a very small ratio of what survives. But the good news is that films are still being discovered. We just got a film in our collection that I hadn't been able to see for years. I know that a collector had put out a copy in the 1960s, and I had not been able to see it anywhere, and it just came to our collection today, called Bronco Billy and the Maid, made here in Niles in 1913. So we're looking forward to getting that digitized so that people can see it on YouTube and other locations. One of the fun things about preservation is that you can also, for films like that were made here in Niles, you can see locations that in many ways look exactly like they did 100 years ago. Niles Canyon looks a lot like it did back then, and so you can actually, through the hills and the scenery and the Alameda Creek that goes through there, you can actually find the exact locations of where many of these films were made originally. For instance, Charlie Chaplin made The Tramp in Niles Canyon and in Niles itself, and you can still see the location in Niles Canyon where Charlie shot the opening and closing scenes of that film. Pretty interesting that people come here just to see where Charlie filmed when he was here in 1915. So let's take a look at the studio building. So in 1913, Anderson decided to build a state-of-the-art studio here in Niles, and Anderson and his partner George Spohr bought property at what's now Niles Boulevard and G Street, and this is the studio building in the middle of being built in about June of 1913. Over here is where the old S&A barn was that they were using until they were able to move into the studio building. And they built it with houses for cast and crew people, 6 of them in 1912, and then another 4 in 1913. This is the horse stable that they used to stable their horses. And this was the reception area over here and Bronco Billy's office on the corner. The editing rooms were over here, and there, behind it was a little theater that they could project the camera negative while they were editing the film to see what they had. In the middle was an enclosed stage, and a little later they built a glass enclosed stage. On this side was the carpenter shop and the scene dock where they painted the flats, and the film developing rooms and all of that stuff. Over here is the studio completed with all 10 houses, the glass enclosed stage, the horse stable. There's even the stagecoach in the little open area there. This was a blacksmith shop here, and in the back were storage areas for their props. And they also built a false front to those buildings so that they could be used as a Western street set. So all 10 of these houses still survive in Niles. But when Anderson had them built, he crossed the property lines so that they could get as many houses on the property as possible. And when they were sold as private residences in the early 1920s, 2 of the houses on 2nd Street had to be removed. They were moved over to School Street, and one of them on G Street was removed so that they could cross all the other buildings onto the property lines again. When they were used for cast and crew people, they were rented to them for $25 a month. Things have changed quite a bit since then. Okay, so let's look at the glass enclosed stage. So this is the glass enclosed stage that they used at the studio, and doing a similar thing that they did with their open air stage behind the barn. They would have these sets for their interior scenes, and the sunlight would be let in but it would keep the wind out, which was a problem on their old open air stage. If you'd see, hair fluttering and dresses waving in the wind when it was supposed to be inside of a house, that was a kind of a telltale giveaway. But with this, it would keep out the wind and still let in the light. And you can see the back door of the stage is open, and two of the back ends of the S&A bungalows are in the background. The bungalows were 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a adjoining closet, walk-in closet, a front room and a dining room, and a small kitchen, and then an enclosed porch in the back. And that's pretty much how all of the houses are today, although many of the houses currently have the enclosed porch as part of the interior of the buildings now, built into it. On the stage here is Ben Turpin, who was one of the comedians. In fact, he was the first comedian that S&A had when they first started in Chicago in 1907. He was in their first film called An Awful Skate, or A Hobo on Wheels. He plays a hobo who gets some roller skates and rolls down the streets of Chicago, bumping into people and knocking them down. That's the whole film. And he continued with S&A for many years, worked at the Chicago studio until 1915, when Chaplin came there and made one film. And then when Chaplin decided to be in California at the Niles studio, Ben Turpin came along. And Ben made quite a few films in 1915 and 1916 here in Niles before he went off to the Keystone studio in Los Angeles and became a big star. While he was here in Niles, he was only making $25 a week. That changed when he went to Keystone and he made several $1,000s a week. I think it was like $2,500 a week he was making at Keystone in the 1920s. So this is what made motion pictures work. This is a Bell & Howell 2709 camera. They started making this model at Bell & Howell in 1912 after the wooden box camera that they'd made 8 of. And this was an extreme advance in motion picture equipment from that time. This was the most advanced camera in the world in 1912. It was an all-metal movie camera with detachable 400-foot magazines and a variable shutter that could close down the shutter to do fade in and fade out or dissolves. It had a 4-lens turret, so you could have multiple focal length lenses and quickly change from one to another. You could also do iris effects and all other kinds of effects with them. In those days, every effect was done in the camera by the cameraman. No post-production CGI type of work. It was all done in the camera. So the cameraman had a huge responsibility to make all of this work and make it functional. And they were all, in those days, hand cranked. Two turns per second was the standard speed of 16 frames. You could go faster to 24, which is the modern film speed. But cameramen also cranked it at any speed because it was totally under their control. They could crank very slow and create speeded up motion, or they could crank fast and create slow motion with this camera. It had a geared head so that you had to pan and tilt while you were cranking. And so obviously you needed 3 hands if you were using pan and tilt while you were cranking. So you needed an assistant essentially to do some of the work while you were, if you needed to go in both directions at once. Sometimes they would just pan and then tilt down or up to refilm or reframe a scene that they were shooting. But you could also do this to do a fast tilt or a pan. This particular camera was made in 1922, and it was owned by Park Rees, a Hollywood cameraman who shot Monty Banks and Lloyd Hamilton, two real comedies in the 1920s. And in the 70s and 80s, it was owned by John Cordy, a Bay Area filmmaker who shot Sesame Street animation with this very camera. So it's got a long history, and that's one of the things about this camera. It was so well built that it had a long, useful life. It had the most accurate film pull down of any camera made. It had fixed registration pins that the film would move in and out of, so that it was absolutely steady. If you wanted to shoot multiple exposures with special effects with, say, one person acting in one side of the screen, you block off the other side and then have the actor on the other side within double exposure. Say if the guy was supposed to be twins or they looked exactly alike, then you could do it in this camera and you wouldn't see the frame line in between that matched one side to the other. It was absolutely steady. And because of that, later on, this was used as an animation or a optical printer camera as well, because it was so well made. And so that's one of the reasons why many of these cameras still survive, because they were so well built. So here we are in the auditorium of the Edison Theatre as part of the Niles SNA Silent Film Museum. And this is the original auditorium that was built in 1913 here in Niles District of Fremont. And all of the SNA people, including Charlie Chaplin and Bronco Billy, watched movies while they were here in Niles. This is a theater that was known as a licensed theater in those days, which meant it was part of the Motion Picture Patents Company that tried to control the industry. And SNA was part of that patents company group, along with Edison, Vitagraph, Biograph, Seelig Polyscope, Kiehn Company, and a few others. And so you got to see the licensed film product, of which SNA was a member. And all of the independent upstarts like Universal, Fox, and Metro, which became Metro Goldwyn Mayer, and Paramount eventually took over the industry and broke the patents company trust. But in those early years, you saw the controlled films that were made by these producing companies, and every week a new program would be here in Niles. And when this theater opened in 1913, a whole evening's program would be 1 hour long. Admission for adults was 10 cents, and for children was 5 cents. And as today, we operate the theater as a silent movie theater. Every Saturday night we show silent films with live piano music, just as they did 100 years ago. And we've been doing that for over 14 years now. We show generally a silent feature film and a couple of short films. Although once a month we have comedy shorts night where we show 4 vintage silent comedies. And those are perhaps our most popular programs. But we have a collection of film prints, over 10,000 films in our collection, of which about half of them are silent films. And so we use that to program our film schedule every week, with occasionally filling in with films that we don't have in our collection from outside sources once in a while. So it's a great way to step back into the past and see how films were made 100 years ago.